So this is a big topic. You devote much time in your book discussing the Rambam's conception of Hashgakha Pratit, divine providence, most notably in chapters 17 and 18. Rambam's view is challenging from a few angles. One challenge is that the Rambam uses Aristotelian ideas to support his premise, which most modern people don't have a very clear understanding of, Aristotelian terms. Also, the modern day Jew doesn't have a clear grasp of concepts like active intellect, which is fundamental to understanding the Rambam's conception. Interestingly, he seems to use Aristotelian methods, yet moves away from Aristotelian ideology in the process. So he's borrowing terms from Aristotle to lay his conception, but he's actually moving away from Aristotle once those conceptions get brought out. Yet another challenge is that the Rambam's idea of Hashgakha seems to be very far away from the sort of Hashgakha we plainly read in the Torah and even in Chazal. And a final challenge is that his view of Hashgakha seems cold and uninspiring compared to the dynamic and interactive divine personality that is depicted in the biblical texts. Can you help our audience navigate this maze and help us get to a clearer understanding of the Rambam?
It's a complicated set of questions to deal with in one go. So we'll start off just by summarizing what is the difference between Rambam's understanding of Hashgakha, of providence, and sort of what you call the standard religious view of providence, which many people have. As we find in many areas, in many shiurim, it's taken for granted the sort of Hashgakha, which we find it's more from the mystical perspective, that every single little movement, every single interaction you have is directly a result of some sort of providential dynamic. Nothing happens. I think even if the Hasidim extend it even in the animal world, no leaf will fall over the worm, nothing will fall from the tree. None of that will happen without God directly causing it to happen. There'll be some sort of cause and effect regarding everything. And Rambam comes at the very opposite angle. Rambam tells us that God created the world. There was a time of creation, and he set up certain laws of nature which are there to last. And they're not interactive. God created everything. He caused everything to happen. He wanted the laws of nature to run a certain way. And it's not that every time a leaf falls from a tree and hits a worm, or I think he said that the spider swallows the fly. That's not a direct providential. That's not God sitting there in his keyboard, kabiyachol, setting smite on the fly. That's just God has set up the world in his wisdom at the time of creation because he wants it to operate a certain way. And at the start, he says, human beings work the same way too. Human beings also are part of this general providence, but he says human beings have a soul. We're made with Tselem and Elokim. We're made in the image of God, and that image of God that allows us to develop ourselves, to develop our mind, our soul, our aspect of humanity, to become something which can be somewhat similar to and thereby connect to God. Create this two-way channel through which we can connect up to God and receive some sort of providential influence back.
Like a pipeline.
1 second, sorry, let's just pour a drink. So, and the Rambam actually cites this idea of the dynamics between the animal kingdom, the spider swallowing the fly. He says we don't believe that. We don't believe that is a direct effect of providence. Rather, as a person develops their mind, develops their character traits, in order to develop their mind, that's a topic in its own right. As a person develops and gets a correct conception of God, studies the Torah, corrects their character traits, they become somewhat godly. And as they do that, they can be subject to a certain sort of intuition, certain flashes of knowledge and inspiration, which can help them navigate the world and be inspired and directed to do the right thing. But generally, this will not involve the laws of nature changing, because as this is what you mean by the Aristotelian model, that the laws of nature are fixed. The Rambam quotes it from Tehillim, something we say every morning in Shacharit. God sets the laws of nature in place, and they won't be abrogated, they won't be manipulated. It's an aspect of perfection of God that he sets up the laws of nature how he wants them to be, and he doesn't need to change them. So, for example, he gives the example of a person who is destined to go on this boat that's going to go down at sea. He says that God won't interrupt the forces of nature to stop the boat going down at sea. What will he do, for example? He'll give this person who has a providential influence some sort of spark of inspiration or intuition or understanding that he shouldn't go on that boat. So he'll work on the person, on this through the Tzelem Elokim, through the mind, through his intellectual channel, exactly whatever we call it, to guide the person not to go on the boat, rather than changing the laws of nature. And that's very different to how we understand things through the Hasidic and even the more mystical, or the way many others in Judaism understand it, that God influences the laws of nature and pulls the strings behind the world. But I think that's what you mean by the Aristotelian look at things, because it seems quite similar to Aristotle, who looks at everything, the permanence of the universe, and nothing moves, nothing changes, from the side of God. So the question is what you moved on to ask is, well, if people nowadays do not relate the world in an Aristotelian way, where does that leave Rambam and his theories? So Rambam, yes, he certainly packages his ideas in the science of his day. He looked at the world in a certain way, and so did his audience for whom he was writing. The crucial question I always feel needs to be asked is not always probing and obsessing about the Aristotelian science, but asking instead, what are the underlying religious ideas which permeate and inform Rambam's worldview? Better put, how might Rambam have applied his principles of religious belief in today's world? If he had been born in, 30, 40 years ago, and you got the young Rambam looking at the world today, he would no longer have been concerned with the spheres and the Aristotelian doctrines of eternity of the universe. He'd been busy with questions of creation, the Big Bang, relativity, evolution, the extent to which these theories can and should be embraced from a religious worldview, and their implications for how we read the opening chapters of the Torah. These are all questions which I address in Judaism Reclaimed, about how Rambam addresses the science of his day, where he sets the bar to accept them and reinterpret the Torah, and how he would apply that to questions and conflicts in our day. So in terms of the active intellect, again, this is another possible example of an Aristotelian framework that Rambam used to present his religious theory. For Aristotle, God doesn't directly relate to humanity. It's through this active intellect, which Rambam equates with the Malachim of some sort. But again, it's not how we look at the world today. And Rambam would always say that if something is proven or disproven, you've got to move along with that, you've got to accept that, and you've got to recalibrate and re-understand and move on, move forward. So it's quite an interesting example I bring near the beginning of Judaism Reclaimed. In his book on Rav Soloveitchik and the Moreh Nevuchim, there's a book by Professor Lawrence Kaplan. It's based on sort of lecture notes that someone took from a lecture of Rav Soloveitchik on Moreh Nevuchim. He claims that in his notes there that the Rav deliberately circumvented the active intellect. You notice when he's describing, again, this is all second or third hand, so it's hard to make any definite conclusions. He says the impression you get is that when Rav Soloveitchik describes the Rambam, it's relating directly to us, not via the active intellect. And he says this is deliberate because in the modern era we can now dispense with this active intellect, and we can perceive ourselves as having a more direct connection with God that can be conceived of relative to what Rambam had. I'm not going to go into this all now, but it's just an example of how when we read Rambam now in the 21st century, I don't believe our primary goal should be discussing all the spheres. Obviously, it's of some historical and academic interest, but we should be trying to understand what are the underlying religious messages and values of the Rambam, and how do we apply that?
Okay.
How do you apply that back today regarding Hashgakha?
Right. So you would extract basically the fundamental points that he from the fundamental religious points, religious ideas that come out, and you would just reapply them and reformulate them.
Repackage that in today's science. And I suppose in another 100, 200 years, science will have moved on again. And we have to take, again, the same religious ideas and repackage them in whatever people are going to they'll have refined or disproven or whatever it is, their views of the world by the time they've moved on. The science is moving very rapidly at the moment. So in terms of Hashgakha, what are the key underlying religious values of the Rambam? So one thing I see is that whereas in some walks of Judaism, they look at nature as being something which we have to sort of push away. The laws of nature are something bad. We have to, the less you believe in nature, the less it binds you, and the Hashgakha will push you beyond that. You'll have Providence, which will push you beyond. You won't have to rely on the laws of nature anymore. Rambam sees it from the very opposite point of view. He says that from looking at the world, we can perceive, we can understand aspects of God's wisdom. So we can get love of God, we can get fear of God. There are two ways we can really understand God from his two great works. We say the Torah is one of them, and the world is the other. And we should look and analyze the world, and through the laws of nature, we can perceive aspects of divine wisdom. So the laws of nature are something which are positive. And again, we don't have to, and we can assume that God instituted them with wisdom, wanted us to understand and follow them. So we can still keep to this idea that the laws of nature are generally immovable. When I was talking about miracles, miracles is a different subject, which Rambam says that sometimes there can be certain things which are inbuilt within the laws of nature at the time of creation. He talks about how the sea splitting and all of that. That's a separate topic. There are such things as miracles, but in general, the laws of nature are consistent. We don't expect anything to have been inbuilt, anything to change. And the reason these laws of nature are consistent are there for us to analyze and understand and relate to God through them, to see how God set up his world, the wisdom within it. So that is something which I think we can maintain in the 21st century too. That in the same way as God doesn't interfere with the laws of nature, he also doesn't interfere generally with the functioning of human free will. That was a big point for the Rambam. So we don't expect, there's something going on in the world, and we don't expect God to sort of press the magic button and zap, and someone's going to kill someone else, and no, they're zapped away. And actually, this point was quite widely held at Orach Chaim. There are quite a number of Torah commentators that share this view. It's become controversial now. The idea that free will is something which is, the Rambam puts it in Hilchot Teshuvah, it's a fundamental pillar of the Torah, that you have free will to act and to see through the results of your actions. So we don't expect the laws of nature to change, and we don't expect our free will to be interfered with. So what is providence? Providence isn't something which is automatic. I can just sit around and believe that God's at his keyboard pressing and manipulating the laws of nature. Hashgakha, providence, is something which has to be earned. How is it earned? It's earned by developing oneself, by perfecting one's character, by perfecting one's mind, and developing through that a relationship with God and understanding of God. That creates a channel, a connection through which we have a providential relationship with him, through which we can receive these flashes of inspiration, flashes of intuition, and an understanding which can guide our actions in the world. That is something which we can apply very much now, even if we dispense with the Aristotelian packaging of the spheres of the active intellect. This is an understanding of seeing the laws of nature as something positive, something divine, which we can understand God through. And the whole point of the world, of the human creation, being to develop our Tzelem Elokim, so that we have this relationship, this connection with him. To me, that's not cold and uninspiring. To me, it's very inspiring. Instead of me being sitting back, hearing a certain person in Yeshiva years ago saying, I'm not going to go and get a degree, I'm not going to go to work, because what does it matter? God's decided how much money I earn on Rosh Hashanah. God could give me £1,000 right now, give me everything I need. It doesn't make a difference if I go to work. He was thoroughly uninspired, because he had been he'd read up and he'd been told so much that God will closely monitor and impact everything you do. So he was sitting there saying, "What's the point of me doing anything?" So to the Rambam is the opposite of that. Rambam is saying, no, if you sit there and do nothing, you're like the fly flying around. You're like the leaf. You have absolutely no hashgakha. You've got no relationship with God. Life is about improving yourself. It's about developing that relationship with God, creating that two-way channel of providence. And you talk about the Torah. The Torah has a very different focus. The Torah is the national story of the Jews. So you're going to have there's something called national providence, which we find at the end of Moreh Nevuchim, that the Avot, the Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, they're told that there will be a certain path that their descendants will go to. There's a covenant, there's a brit, that they're told that their children, their descendants will form a nation which will go through certain processes. It will form as a nation in the Khur Barzel, the furnace of Egypt, will receive the Torah, and will have to go through certain training in the desert. And that was a time with open miracles. But again, while we see these open miracles in the Torah, the final book of the Torah, Devarim, makes it very clear that is not that's not the ideal. The ideal is they're going to go into the land. We see this several times. You're going to go into the land, and you're going to have to work the land, and you're going to have to remember God and remember the messages of the man, remember the messages of the Torah, remember all the messages that you learned in the desert. It should be part of your national consciousness, and you take that message and you implement it in the land while you're working within the physical world. And I've seen Hasidic sources also going along these lines. It's not just the Rambam. It's this idea that yes, there are miraculous stories throughout the Torah, but these aren't seen as the end game. This is part of the national story which we have, which guides us towards the goal we're supposed to be in. In our era, in which our personal and national lives are supposed to become lifelong efforts to build a meaningful and providential relationship with God, we are supposed to take those messages, take the messages of the Torah and apply them in our life in order to build that relationship with God and build that providential channel which allows us to transcend the natural world, which is governed completely by the laws of nature, doesn't arise beyond that.
And I think actually a great modern example that I like to use is, it's kind of like you're tapping into a frequency, which is kind of like there's music playing right now all around us. We just need a radio transmitter to tap into it. It's there, but you have to make yourself a vessel to receive that. And the relationship we have with Hashem is what we put into it as well. It's not a one-sided thing. He's not just going to...
That is what is so inspiring about Judaism and Rambam's Judaism. You can't just sit there and say, it's all going to arrive to me. You have got to go and create that relationship.
And regarding the laws of nature and miracles and all that, I find it very interesting that, you mentioned that Aristotle was used by the Rambam because that was the best he had at his time. We've talked about this in previous podcasts. So he was using the tool that was best available to him. He wasn't necessarily an Aristotelian. He was obviously arguing against him on many points. But even Chazal, there are some parts where Chazal, going back to the Talmudic era, the Mishnaic era, they are actually also using the same tools of their time. For example, they said that there are 10 miracles that were built into nature, right? And one of them is like the staff, and one of them is the talking donkey of Bilam. Now, all of these things are there. Why were they doing that? They could have just said, no, God could make a donkey talk. We shouldn't even question it. No, they felt compelled to use some type of rational explanation for how these things happened, and they didn't have the means to express it properly. So by the time the Rambam came along, he's using the same fundamental approach, but he had better
teachings of Chazal as some sort of basis for his understanding of miracles.
Exactly. So yeah, that's just, I think that was a really amazing point to bring up by you. And I want to jump into the next point because your book has so many great topics, and there's we don't even know where to.
It would take 10 podcasts to really go to justice.